Mr. President, I have a lot of concerns.
Senator, quorum call.
As the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
I have a lot of concerns about the possibility of Brett Kavanaugh serving on the Supreme Court. They're concerns that come from many different directions. But let's start with the precedent that this body has not reviewed his full record. We haven't taken any look at all at the 3 years he spent as staff secretary to President Bush because the president's team intervened and asked us not to. And a couple members of this body collaborated with the White House to deny everybody else here the possibility of looking at his record. You know, but the thing is that each and every one of us has a responsibility to review the record. This exceptional situation in which a few members have made it impossible for anyone in the body to fulfill their constitutional responsibility is an extraordinary abuse of power in this body. And then we have the President of the United States reaching out in other ways, in ways we've never seen before, and putting the stamp of presidential privilege on some 100,000 documents. Now, these were documents from the time that Brett Kavanaugh served at the White House Counsel. We received a few documents, and there were a lot of troubling things in those documents. About 100,000 were censored by the President of the United States. Can I just remind my colleagues, the President's not supposed to interfere with the work of the Senate and the confirmation process. It's called the separation of powers. Maybe some of you would like to pull out your Constitution and study it for a moment and realize the President nominates but doesn't get to decide what this body reviews. And yet, with that stamp of presidential power untested, has done so for, as far as we can tell, the first time in U.S. history. And then we have the fact that he asked the same individual who had given the stamp of presidential power for to proceed to make some 140,000 documents committee confidential so that the public couldn't see them. Well, that too was untested. That too was an original strategy. That too was a situation of minimizing the conversation that experts could have over what was in those records. Of those three phases, I think the one that bothers me most is the second one, the use of the stamped presidential privilege on 100,000 documents. When presidential privilege, otherwise known as executive privilege, was used in the past, a document was looked at and it was determined what constitutional test does this meet for special treatment. Now, you would think that since these were documents from the Bush administration, the Trump administration couldn't make any of the arguments that are normally made about compromising conversations within the White House. But no explanation was given. This was just straight out censorship across the board. Now, I challenged that censorship, and the hearing that was supposed to take place, unfortunately, won't take place because of this rush to complete the confirmation before the Senate can get hold of those documents, before that hearing can occur. Why the rush to cooperate with the White House to prevent this body from seeing those 100,000 pages that were censored by the White House? What is the President hiding? Is it Brett Kavanaugh's involvement in the policy of torture? Is it Brett Kavanaugh's involvement in holding the documents stolen from Senate Democrats because we know he received them? Is it his involvement in other nominations where he said he wasn't very involved? What's in those 100,000 documents that the White House was desperate that this body not review? So that's That's certainly troubling. No nomination should go forward without a review by this body of the nominee's records, certainly not for a lifetime appointment, certainly not for the Supreme Court. And then there's concern over the temperament of the individual. Certainly out of the millions of Americans, the hundreds of millions of Americans across this land, certainly there's at least 9 who have the temperament to serve. No need to turn to someone who's belligerent and condescending. No need to turn to someone who is angry and unstable. But what did we see? That's exactly what we saw when he testified before the Senate committee. He said things like, "Some of you were lying in wait and had it ready," although he said it in an angrier tone than that. He said, "This confirmation has become a national disgrace." Well, I don't actually argue with that, because it is a disgrace because of the compromises of fairness that have occurred in this process towards the women who came forward. When he was asked by Senator Klobuchar if he's ever been blackout drunk, he responded, "I don't know. Have you?" Well, interesting response. Did he respond, "I don't know," because he can't remember, because he blacked out? Was that his point? And then we saw the partisan rhetoric, a frenzy on the left to come up with something, anything to block my confirmation. Angry and partisan all at one moment. And he went on to say much more about things being calculated and orchestrated, about things being a hit, fueled with pent-up anger about President Trump. He talked about fear unfairly stoked. He talked about revenge on behalf of the Clintons. Well, and he threatened the Senate. He said, "As we all know, what goes around comes around." This man, with these quotes, qualified to serve on that special body known as the Supreme Court of the United States? I don't think so. When he talked about the fact that he didn't drink too much and didn't become belligerent, yet we saw a lot of belligerence when he came before the body. This is called not having judicial temperament. That performance of intemperate behavior led to 2,400 law professors noting that it was improper, inappropriate, simply wrong that this man should serve. They wrote a letter, October 3rd, the Senate should not confirm Kavanaugh. The letter presented to us the following day, and they said this. They said, "Judicial temperament is one of the most important qualities of a judge. As the Congressional Research Service explains, a judge requires, quote, a personality that is even-handed, unbiased, impartial, courteous yet firm, and dedicated to a process, not a result. The concern for judicial temperament dates back to our founding. In Federalist 78, titled Judges as Guardians of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton expressed the need for the integrity and moderation of the judiciary. The letter continues, "We are law professors who teach, research, and write about the judicial institutions of this country. Many of us appear in state and federal means that we will continue to do so, including before the United States Supreme Court. We regret that we feel compelled to write to you, our senators, to provide our views that at the Senate hearings on September 27th, Judge Brett Kavanaugh displayed a lack of judicial temperament that would be disqualifying for any court, and certainly for elevation to the highest court of this land. They continue, based on their background, 2,400 law professors from across the country, saying the question at issue was, of course, painful for anyone. But Judge Kavanaugh exhibited a lack of commitment to judicious inquiry. Instead of being open to the necessary search for accuracy, Judge Kavanaugh was repeatedly aggressive with questionnaires. Even in his prepared remarks, Judge Kavanaugh described the hearing as partisan, referring to it as a calculated and orchestrated political hit, rather than acknowledging the need for the Senate, faced with new information, to try to understand what had transpired. Instead of trying to sort out with reason and care the allegations that were raised, Judge Kavanaugh responded in an intemperate, inflammatory, and partial manner, and he interrupted and at times was discourteous to senators. As you know, under two statutes governing bias and recusal, judges must step aside if they are at risk of being perceived as being unfair. As Congress has previously put it, a judge or justice shall disqualify himself in any proceeding in which his impartiality might reasonably be questioned. These statutes are part of a myriad of legal commitments to the impartiality of the judiciary, which is a cornerstone of the courts. We have differing views about the other qualifications of Judge Kavanaugh, but we are united as professors of law and scholars of judicial institutions in believing that he did not display the impartiality and judicial temperament requisite to sit on the highest court of the land. Signed with their respective institutional affiliations, 2,400 law professors, saying that this man is not suited to serve. Another concern not mentioned in that letter was his fidelity to truth. Mispresentations, misrepresentations, inaccuracies, and straight-out whoppers. Some of our colleagues, like my colleague, the senior senator from South Carolina, said, "I have argued to you that when you found that a judge was a perjurer, you couldn't in good conscience send him back into the courtroom, because everybody that came in that courtroom thereafter would have a real serious doubt." A real serious doubt over whether or not the truth was being told. Brett Kavanaugh said, all witnesses to his alleged assault of Dr. Ford refuted her claim or said it didn't happen. What is the truth? Only one person said it didn't happen, Brett Kavanaugh. All those other folks he said refuted it, nobody refuted it. They said they couldn't remember, but they didn't refute it. And one said, while she couldn't remember, she believed Dr. Ford. So, Brett Kavanaugh in the most generous capacity, simply doesn't have the ability to keep the facts straight on a pretty straightforward thing, big difference between refuting and not remembering, or he deliberately misrepresented the facts, in which case he lied. Brett Kavanaugh said he first heard of Deborah Ramirez's allegations in the period since the New Yorker published its story. But we've had multiple reports that Brett Kavanaugh and his team were working to discredit Ramirez before the New Yorker story. Well, why did he say that he learned about it after, when he was working to discredit it before? Did he think this was clever, that he could kind of say, well, I heard about the full story in the New Yorker after the New Yorker article was published? Was that what he was trying to imply, like maybe I can slip by on that one? Because he didn't want people to know that he knew about it early and had worked to discredit her? Another whopper from Brett Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh said he did not travel in the same social circles as Dr. Ford, who went to Holton Arms. But what was the truth? His classmates said they routinely socialized with the Holton Arms girls. So much for that statement. Brett Kavanaugh said he categorically did not receive documents stolen from Democratic senators and their staffs by Manny Miranda in the early 2000s. But in one of those documents that didn't get censored, that slipped its way through to the Senate, what did we find out? It shows he clearly received the stolen documents. Another lie from Brett Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh that Judge Pickering's nomination was not one he primarily handled. Well, let's just say this is less than the full truth. Maybe if you emphasize the words primarily, you find some shred of accuracy, but it's certainly not a full and appropriate presentation, because it turns out that he was involved in a number of critical aspects of the Pickering nomination. Brett Kavanaugh said he did not see or hear anything about President Bush's warrantless wiretapping program before it was publicly reported. But in some of those other documents that slipped through, we find out that he did know about them. And he emailed John Yoo about the warrantless wiretapping long before the program became public. Brett Kavanaugh said the Bush administration did not consider ideology when selecting or vetting judges. But the truth is, the documents show that they did consider ideology. Why did this man, Brett Kavanaugh, feel the need to misrepresent the truth time after time after time? He implied that when it came to drinking, that he didn't drink excessively, that he did not get aggressive, and yet we have person after person after person saying that's exactly what happened. He said the phrase "Renate alumnius" in his yearbook was clumsily intended to show affection. Let me repeat that quote, clumsily intended to show affection. And he continued, and that she was one of us. Isn't it nice he and his colleagues got together to pick out this one young lady to show in their yearbooks that they had affection for her. You can put $100 into a campaign, then you are granting the Koch brothers 1 million times the influence. It's the exact opposite of Jefferson's equal voice principle. Does Kavanaugh have the slightest understanding that the construction of the Constitution was to avoid the powerful running the government by and for the powerful? The Constitution was a response to that very problem in Europe. No sign of that. No interest in that. In fact, quite the opposite. He's bragged about being the most pure on the First Amendment. And what does that mean? It means that he loves the weaponization of the First Amendment, twisted as an instrument to give the powerful victories over the people time and time again. Decisions against the environment, decisions against workers, decisions against consumers, decisions against reproductive rights. That's the rush to put this man unqualified in every possible way to serve on the Supreme Court, not having the temperament, not having the integrity. That's the rush. Secure and ensure that Jefferson's concept of equal voice is destroyed. The most troubling, or another hugely troubling, I guess really the most troubling, is his conduct towards women. The fact that he collaborated with other boys to damage the integrity of a young woman. That was troubling. It's troubling, beyond troubling, the story of his assault on Dr. Ford. But you might say, wait, we don't have any corroborating information about that. You know, Dr. Ford asked for her corroborating witnesses to come before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And how many of those were allowed to come before the committee? Well, none. None. Zero. The committee was determined to make it just he said and she said without any other information. That is treating an individual unfairly. Absolutely unfairly. To cherry-pick information only to allow it to support one side of an argument. Deny her the ability to bring her corroborating people before the Judiciary Committee. Even in 1991, that was not done with Anita Hill. This body treated Dr. Ford worse. And then the sham of the reopened FBI investigation, which was only reopened because one courageous colleague from Arizona said, I'm not going forward unless we really examine these situations that involve his assault on women. But the decision on how to conduct that FBI investigation wasn't up to this chamber, it's up to the president. And the president does a scoping document, tells the FBI who to talk to. And apparently he consulted with the leadership, it is reported, the Republican leadership of this chamber, on who to let the FBI consult with, and the result was not to consult or talk to interview a single one of those 8 people that Dr. Ford asked to be interviewed. We'll take some time, I guess, to know exactly who said what to whom. It was the president's decision, so the responsibility rests there. But in the interest of fairness, was there not one member of this body in that conversation who could speak up and say, we want the facts? Not a whitewash, we want the facts. And apparently, no one did. No one insisted on that. They said, no, we'll go forward even if we hide all of the facts. So then there was Debbie Ramirez, who shared her story of being assaulted, her story from the college dorm, and in that case, she said there are 20 people that the FBI should talk to. Well, she wasn't invited to appear before the Judiciary Committee at all. And none of her 20 individuals that she suggested should be talked to were invited. So she got no hearing, complete exclusion. And yet many members of this chamber attacked her. You think that's fair? Attacking the person but not letting her come before this chamber to give her story? Do you think that's fair? It's not fair. And then to have the FBI receive instructions from the White House after consultation with the Republican leadership, and the result is they didn't talk to one of her corroborating witnesses, not one. Why, in this day and age where we've been in the middle of a Me Too conversation, can the individuals in this chamber on the right side of the aisle take such joy in being so unfair to a woman coming forward to share a story? Because it's even worse, because each one knew, if they read the newspapers, that there was a lot of corroborating information. Kenneth Appold was in the same suite in the dorm, lived in the same suite, 2 bedrooms sharing a common space. And he heard the story. He independently recalled many of the same details that Ramirez shared, including a male student had encouraged Kavanaugh as he exposed himself. The classmate recalled the party took place in a common room on the first floor. I've known this all along, he said. Quote, it's been on my mind all these years when his name came up. It was a big deal. How come his voice was not allowed to come before the Senate? Why did the FBI not talk to him and put it into the report? Well, I'll tell you why. It was so that senators could go down and review the report and say, oh, there's no new information. Well, of course there's no new information, because the president's team reportedly asked the Republicans' leadership what they wanted done, and apparently they didn't want any of the people who had corroborating information to be talked to or reported on. That is a betrayal of justice. That is a complete corruption of justice. Mr. Appold is a professor now. He's a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary. He's deeply respected. He said, it's been on my mind all these years when his name, referring to Kavanaugh, when his name came up. It was a big deal. The story stayed with him, he said, because it was disturbing and seemed outside the bounds of acceptable behavior, even during heavy drinking at parties on campus. He said he'd been shocked, but not necessarily surprised, because the social group to which Kavanaugh belonged often drank to excess. He recalled that Brett Kavanaugh was relatively shy until he drank, at which point he could become aggressive and even belligerent. Now, this individual, Kenneth, maybe you're quick to judge and say, well, he just invented this memory. Except here's the problem. He shared it with his roommate from his first year in graduate school. He told about what had happened that year. So he has a professor at a theological seminary. He lived in the same suite. He heard the story about it shortly after it happened. It disturbed him so much he shared it with his classmate or his roommate from his first year in graduate school. That's pretty persuasive substantiation of Debbie Ramirez's story. Or there was another classmate, Richard O., an emergency room doctor in California. He recalled overhearing, soon after the party, a female student tearfully recounting to another student an incident at the party involving a gag with, well, you know the story, followed by a male student exposing himself. Was Richard O. invited to come before the Senate and tell his story? No, he wasn't. Another transgression of justice. Did the FBI talk to him? No, because they had instructions not to talk to these individuals who had corroborating information. This situation in which when a woman comes forward to share a story, she's treated with disdain by this institution. That's why these women didn't want to come forward. They thought they would be mistreated, and unfortunately, it turned out to be right. And everyone supporting and voting for Kavanaugh shares the shame of the mistreatment of Dr. Ford and the mistreatment of Debbie Ramirez. And across this land, it's caused women to relive the experiences that they have gone through. Many of them writing to our offices. And I encourage every senator to read every one of the letters they're getting before voting this afternoon, late this afternoon, on the question of whether Kavanaugh should serve on the court. I read 5 letters earlier, but I've received a lot of letters. I'm going to read more of them now. So this individual writes, please do what you can do. No, please do what you can to block the Kavanaugh vote to the Supreme Court. I am also a victim of sexual assault when I was in graduate school in the early 1970s. I never pursued that due to fear of consequences and feeling that this was my fault. This has to stop, she concludes the letter. Do you think that she got any encouragement from the completely unjust way that this body treated these 2 women? No. It's exactly the classic setup and rigged response that so often women have met when they had the courage to come forward with their stories. Another woman wrote, I cried all the way to work listening to Dr. Christine, referring to Christine Blasey Ford. If you can do anything as my senator, do everything you can to change the course of our national court decision. There isn't much more I can say as a mom, a professional, as a sexual assault victim who has never come forward. Please. Well, I appreciate her writing to me, and I share her concern and the belief that we should change the course that we seem to be on at the moment. Because there is nothing like confirming this man without fairly examining the women courageous to come forward that is more insulting to all of these women who went through the experience of being assaulted. Another Oregonian writes to me, I am a survivor of sexual abuse. I was assaulted as a child by someone my family trusted, then again by a stranger when I was in college. In both instances, I remember the sinking feeling I had afterward, the feeling that even if I spoke up, I wouldn't be believed. I've long felt trapped inside my own trauma, but over the past couple weeks, I have drawn such strength from the sisterhood of survivors who have shown up, protested, shouted out their own survivor stories. I have drawn strength from Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's testimony. I know that because she stepped forward, other survivors will feel brave enough to speak up too. There is power and comfort when women come together and speak our truth before the world. And I say to Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, I'm sorry that you were treated in this horrific manner by the Judiciary Committee of the U.S. Senate. I'm sorry that you were treated so unfairly that not a single one of your corroborating witnesses were pulled before the committee. I feel terrible that the FBI did not talk to any of the people you asked them to talk to. It was a rigged system. You were set up. You were betrayed by this body, by the leadership of this body. But your courageous action coming forth was not without results. This woman, like thousands of others, are looking to you and saying, thank you. Thank you for the courage you had to share, even though you were afraid that you would be treated unfairly. You came forward anyway. And that gives others courage to share their stories. Unfortunately, your fears, Dr. Ford, were justified. May it never be again the case. And the only right thing now is for us to not send Brett Kavanaugh to the court. There's an article that appeared in an Oregon newspaper, and I'm going to read the story, but like the newspaper, not share her name. And the newspaper story starts out this way. The event happened 75 years ago when Dorothy, with, in quotes, not her real name, watched the testimonies. When Dorothy watched the testimonies of Christine Blasey Ford and Brett Kavanaugh on television Thursday during Kavanaugh's Supreme Court confirmation hearings, the memories came flooding back. And for the first time, she felt she must tell her story, a story she never told her mother, a story she didn't tell her husbands either. Dorothy's story is similar to the story Blasey told Thursday in testimony that's part of the confirmation hearings for Supreme Court Justice nominee Kavanaugh. Blasey accused Kavanaugh of attempting to rape her when they were both at a house party with a group of high school students. Kavanaugh denied the accusations, which are now the subject of an FBI investigation. Dorothy, now 91, was a student at Reedsport High School in the 1940s. One day, she was at a friend's house where several kids her age were gathered. She said she was carried into a bedroom by a popular football player, and before she knew what was happening, she found herself pinned to a bed underneath the boy who was struggling to get her pants off. He was both a, quote, big man on campus and, end of quote, women who live with the torment of sexual abuse. I would love it if this letter said, I was afraid that the all-male majority of the Judiciary Committee would treat Dr. Ford unfairly. I was afraid, but relieved when they heard her out. I was relieved when they insisted that those who could back up her story were allowed to testify. I was relieved and pleased. They took her seriously enough. They insisted the FBI. They told the president the FBI has to talk to those folks for us to have any credibility. I would love for this letter to say that. But it doesn't say any of those things because this body, this leadership, let her down and let every woman across America down who has been a victim of sexual violence. Another woman wrote and said, today's hearing was difficult, yet important to watch. As a victim of sexual assault myself, I applaud your support, hearing Dr. Ford's accounts and believing in doing what's right and just. Wouldn't it be better if this letter could say, I applaud the Senate and the Senate leadership and the President of the United States for believing in doing what's right and just. But we didn't get letters like that, did we? Another individual writes, today was an extremely difficult day watching the Kavanaugh hearings. I was so amazed by the bravery Dr. Ford showed throughout her testimony. Her experience was raw and credible. As a young victim of sexual assault, I feel emboldened because of Dr. Ford's testimony. Women need to be heard and believed. We have to hold the Supreme Court to the highest standards. Brett Kavanaugh is clearly not a candidate for the Supreme Court. Isn't that right, that we should ensure that we have the highest standards for those who serve on the Supreme Court? All those district judges across the land writing their decisions, but they get appealed to the circuit courts. And all those circuit courts writing their opinions, but they get appealed to the Supreme Court, to 9 individuals. Isn't it important that we proceed to ensure that, quote, hold the Supreme Court to the highest standards? We will not do that if we confirm Brett Kavanaugh to the court. We will be setting an abysmally low standard for integrity because of all the falsehoods he's told, an incredibly low standard for behavior. We saw the behavior and the partisanship. We didn't see judicial temperament and impartiality. He violates basically every standard you would set for someone to serve on the Supreme Court. And yet, we're having a vote later today with an indication that he'll be approved. Here's another letter. I am a sexual assault survivor. I watched today. The sex crimes prosecutor looked like she had nailed Kavanaugh by his own calendar. Dr. Ford testified that it was early in the evening and casual. It appears the assault happened at the home that Kavanaugh and friends worked out. This is when the majority Judiciary Committee members took over and became angry partisans. Well, that's all she writes. But I think what bothered a lot of people was that the majority chose to bring in a prosecutor to question Dr. Ford, as if Dr. Ford had committed a crime. She didn't commit a crime, my friends. She's a brave woman who came forward to share her story, hoping she'd be taken seriously and treated fairly. Afraid she wouldn't, and it turned out her fears were justified. And hiring a prosecutor to treat her like a criminal? Wow. Insult to injury. This story is longer. This letter is longer. 16th story I'm reading that I've received from constituents back home. Watching Dr. Ford's treatment in the Senate today, I am having a hard time getting my own work done. Dr. Ford's assault experience parallels my own in ways I have not thought about in years. However, unlike Judge Kavanaugh, my assailant was able to complete the assaults he set out to do, because we were not inebriated at the time he violated me. He merely used his size to overpower me, outweighing me by 150 pounds. Like Brett Kavanaugh, my assailant attended an all-boys Catholic school, attended a prestigious university, went on to become an attorney. I have considered, because of the types of clients he represents, bringing the multiple assaults he perpetrated over the course of 2 weeks while I stayed with his family across the country from my own, to the attention of the state bar where he practices, or journalists in the state where he defended Catholic priests accused of abusing children. Seeing now what Dr. Ford is being put through, knowing she was driven from her home and threatened and is now being assaulted by your colleagues, gives me pause. My assailant isn't up for any prestigious promotion. He's not on a short list for a federal judicial position or running for any public office. It's been 18 years, and the statute of limitations in the state where this took place may or may not have run out, depending on how the acts are defined. If my assailant decides to follow through with his goal to become a politician, my calculus may change. For now, I need you to do what you can to shut this nomination down, to show the world that you not only believe Dr. Ford, but you honor her testimony. Your colleagues, your Republican colleagues, clearly believe her. They just don't think it matters. Please, as a survivor and a constituent, I am begging you, make her testimony matter. Are we going to make her testimony matter? We're going to make it matter if if we send Kavanaugh to a seat on the Supreme Court. Her desire, her interest, her possibility of coming forward is cut short by the way she saw this Senate treat a very sad commentary on the injustice perpetrated by this body. This is letter number 17. I've got more than 50 letters here. So you can start to hear the themes are very similar of women being assaulted, women hearing in Dr. Ford's story their own experience, and of asking the Senate to treat the women who have come forward with fairness and justice, and being deeply disturbed that they have not been treated with fairness or justice. But there is still time. There's still time until we vote and send Kavanaugh forward. If we vote no, as these women ask, because an individual with this record does not belong on the court, then we will have honored the courage of these individuals to come forward. As a survivor of assault, starts the next letter, it's important to me that the nominee for one of the highest offices have an impeccable record, which Kavanaugh has demonstrated he does not have, both through his reactionary hearing and the accusations against him from survivors. I implore you to be a voice of reason in the chaos. My first assault happened in 2011. I am so ashamed that the only way my sister found out was because she found an STD test I'd received from Planned Parenthood and asked me about it. I was 24. I had nightmares for months. It changed everything. My second assault happened in 2015. I was drunk and in an unfamiliar part of town. An acquaintance offered to give me a ride when I was leaving a bar and my phone died. She goes on to describe the attack and says, I say this not for shock value, but to emphasize how painful watching this hearing was, and how unsurprised I'll be if Kavanaugh is confirmed. Unsurprised because she doesn't expect men to treat women fairly who have been assaulted and come forward. And everything that has happened in this chamber confirms that. Next letter notes, as a survivor of sexual assault, this issue is of the utmost importance. I rarely speak of these events and have tears streaming down my face just writing this. I was unable to report my assaults for various reasons, including explicit death threats, fear of exposure by the media, and threats by several powerful men who had the ability to end my career before it had even really begun. This situation hits so close to home that it has been physically painful for me to watch much of the coverage. I have been unable to obtain justice for myself, and that is soul-crushing. But what would be a greater travesty is to allow a serial predator a lifetime appointment affecting the lives of every single woman in America. Are we going to be part of a greater travesty? Letter number 19. As a constituent and a victim, I am writing to you to make sure that you vote against Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation. During his hearings, Kavanaugh misled Judiciary Committee under oath. He refused to say whether a sitting president must obey a subpoena and refused to answer whether President Trump could pardon himself or bribe someone with a pardon. And now, Kavanaugh has been accused of sexual assault by multiple women. Kavanaugh's answers during his confirmation hearings add to the evidence that Trump nominated him not to protect the American people, not to protect the Constitution, but to protect himself. It's only a few weeks ago that Trump's former lawyer incriminated him in 2 felonies. It's becoming inevitable that a Trump case will reach the Supreme Court, either over his role in crimes to win the White House or a subpoena to answer questions from the special counsel. We already know that Kavanaugh believes sitting presidents should not be under criminal prosecution or even investigation. Now, under oath, Kavanaugh isn't even pretending he will be an impartial justice. That is exactly why Trump nominated Kavanaugh to be his get-out-of-jail-free card. Letter 20 begins, as a rape victim myself, I am livid that this man is even being considered for a high position. Brett Kavanaugh's views are extreme. His belligerent behavior during the hearing shows he should not sit on the highest court in the country. I urge you to reject this radical choice of a justice who would put our basic rights at risk. Use your constitutional authority of advice and consent to ensure that the president cannot place unfit extremists in positions of power that can affect us for decades. Serving for life on the highest court, justices have the solemn responsibility to be fair, to be even-handed, to uphold the sanctity of our laws and our Constitution, and to keep faith with the letter and spirit of the nation's core, public health, environmental, civil rights, and labor laws. His record rejects these principles. Please do all in your power to stop Brett Kavanaugh's nomination. Letter after letter reminds us that the Supreme Court is so important. We should only send individuals to serve on that bench who are of unimpeachable character. Letter 21. Members of Congress who have joined the 21st century, many whose eyes, ears, hearts, and minds have witnessed the scourge of sexual misconduct. I am a 58-year-old Native American, Native Oregonian. I grew up on a Catholic Indian mission with both my parents and 7 brothers and sisters. Later in life, I recalled through discussions with my younger sister that my older brothers had most likely sexually abused me when I was a very young girl, less than 7 years old. I never reported it because I didn't recall it until I was in my 40s. My parents were alive and it would have destroyed them. I'm a sexual assault survivor who never told my best friend in high school when one rape occurred. She proceeds to share information about several other assaults when she was serving in the Army. And she says each time she didn't report it. All of those incidents left me fearful, feeling vulnerable, psychological damage, PTSD, emotional trauma, physical trauma, and other problems too incalculable to quantify. I think that these topics are often not discussed. Women in our own lives may have had experiences they have never shared with us, thinking that they might be blamed, feeling that they are ashamed, considering that they might not be believed, anticipating that they might expect that we would feel they should somehow have prevented it or somehow invited it. All of these complex sense that they will not be treated with respect and dignity as the victims they are. Let us treat them with the respect and dignity when they bring forward their stories. Dear Senator Merkley, I've never taken the time to write a senator. With Trump as president, or having Trump as president, has caused depression and anxiety. But I have gritted my teeth, battened down the hatches, and tried to weather the storm. However, this saga with Kavanaugh has mobilized me to speak out and protest a person of his moral ineptitude. I am a victim of sexual assault. I'm sure you're hearing the outpouring of messages like mine from hundreds of women. I am so angry and so bitter about the current environment that promotes racism, sexism. The things I've seen voted in make me despair. Rather than the Senate behaving in a way that makes women despair, what if we behaved in a way that inspired, set an example, had people say, we didn't think you'd rise to the challenge, because so often we've seen women mistreated when they bring forward their stories, but you shocked us because you took it seriously and you treated these women fairly. Wouldn't that be a beautiful story rather than the reality of where we are right now? Letter 29. There are a number of viable options for this Supreme Court seat. Individuals not accused of any crimes, and regardless of innocence or guilt, Kavanaugh has shown himself to be unqualified to remain impartial as a judge. Furthermore, the backlash of there being any question of guilt regarding rape accusations is too great for him to successfully fulfill the duties of that position. It will cause a division between voters that will likely never be healed. Speaking as both a concerned voter and rape survivor, there's no legitimate reason that we cannot find another candidate for this job. If he is appointed despite these allegations, it will be all but impossible for a rape survivor to ever feel safe in the U.S. again. How could we, if an accused rapist is presiding as a member of the highest court in the country? She makes a point. There are many other people who could be considered to be brought forward. Why this individual who demonstrated such partisanship? Why this individual who bent and, yes, broke the truth many a time before the committee? Why this individual who wrote offensive, mocking, accusing, disgracing things, attacking a woman in his yearbook? Why this individual who chose to join a fraternity with a reputation for assaulting women? Why this individual who chose to join a secret society with a similar reputation? Why this individual with whom credible women have come forward and shared their stories of assault? And why this individual when we have the full opportunity to have considered the corroborating information from 28 individuals that they asked that we talked to, and we didn't? Still time to reject this nomination and somehow restore the tarnished reputation that's the product of the behavior of this body during this nomination process. Letter number 30. I am 66 years old, nearly 67, and can tell you exactly what occurred when I was a victim of sexual assault and attempted rape at age 16. It was burned into my memory and will forever be a part of me. I continue to be shaken to the core that anyone would explain such behavior as normal part of young men growing up. It is unconscionable, unacceptable, and must no longer be ignored. Dear Senator, letter number 31. I'm reaching out to you as a survivor of teenage rape. Like so many other survivors, I have been following the events surrounding Judge Kavanaugh's nomination with so much emotion that I cannot really begin to express it. I do not believe that I need to ask you to say no if, when it comes to a floor vote, but want you to add my voice to the many who are speaking out in the hope that the country will listen. Sexual assault affects millions of girls, boys, women, and men. Too many of us live our lives in shame and silence, disbelieved, if not outright blamed. Nearly 30 years have passed since a fellow student at my small-town high school took my innocence to then proceed and publicly shame me. People believed him, not me. This has to stop. People need to realize that we may forget some details, but we will never, never forget what happened. And when we know the perpetrator, we will never forget his name. He may grow old. His appearance may change, but his name will remain etched in our brains forever. She goes on to say that putting Kavanaugh on the court means, quote, telling all of us, the countless millions, that we do not matter. And she closes by saying, we matter, I matter. Yes, you do. And when you say that you are adding your voice to the many who are speaking out in the hope that the country will listen, I commend you. Commend you for being brave enough to share your story and to ask those in this chamber to listen. But so far they have not listened, because listening would mean to treat with respect and dignity the women coming forward. Listening would mean to give these women the opportunity not just to present their case, their experience, but have those who can corroborate their information come before the Judiciary Committee and share their stories. Listening would mean insisting that the FBI actually talk to the corroborators rather than not talk to the corroborators. And so you have not been listened to, I am sorry to report. But there is still time. For someone, for several people, to say, we've reflected on the situation and realized how unfair and unjust we have been, how much we add to the trauma of millions of women by not listening to the women who have come forward, not taking them seriously, rigging the system as they feared would happen. This individual writes, I have a voice even if Those screams were stifled inside of me so long ago. Today, that voice says, Kavanaugh is not fit to be a member of the Supreme Court. Beyond the details of what transpired when he was a teenager, his atrocious display during Thursday's hearing should disqualify him outright. Integrity, level-headedness, respect for the rule of law, lack of partisan bias should be fundamental requirements of any justice. Kavanaugh did not display those traits. His information would stain the Senate and judiciary for years to come. I will conclude by saying that Dr. Ford's incredible courage has helped me more than any therapy session. She spoke. In speaking her truth to power, she spoke for all of us. I have shed so many tears watching and following these proceedings, but finally feel like I can stand tall, that I do not need to hide or live in shame. Her story is, in so many ways, my story. The smart girl who loved math and somehow made it through Stanford, completed a PhD, and embarked in a career in research despite the trauma that followed. All too often, we hide behind a smile and a mask of strength so that people do not see that inside we cannot stop shaking. Lawmakers would be well advised to not underestimate the strength of our power when we raised our heads, shed our shame, and reclaim our voices. We may tremble, but we will speak. We will be heard, and we will not be dismissed. Letter number 32. I am a victim of sexual abuse as a child, rape as a young adult, and sexual harassment during my professional career. I am also a successful practicing child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist with 20-plus years of experience. Since Ms. Ford's testimony, I saw 2 female walk-in patients, one of whom revealed to me her own sexual assault, which occurred around the time of Ms. Ford's. She confessed this is the first time she has told anyone about this. The other woman I saw that day told a similar story. From the press, I understand crisis lines lit up all over our nation, doubling their traffic in some cases. I write because I am worried. The press reports that only 2 of the 3 women making complaints will be interviewed by the FBI. I am concerned that only 2 of the 3 alleged victims will be heard. To establish a pattern, the FBI must include as many credible victims and witnesses as possible, particularly given the timelines and deadlines they're up against. Statistics on rape in the United States are shockingly high, higher even than many less developed countries. She was concerned the FBI would not be able to speak and interview those who